Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of At the Corner of Main Street and Wall Street. And for those in the U.S., we wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving and holiday season. Well, the U.S. election's been decided, and we couldn't have picked a better guest to follow up on what's next for Main Street and Wall Street than Viktor Shvets. He's a global strategist and an expert on financial markets. Victor's the author of the recently published book, The Twilight Before the Storm, and I highly encourage you to go out and get a copy, whether you're going to read it or listen to it. Victor's here to challenge us with everything you thought you knew about capitalism, freedom, and the future of humanity, from the streets of Soviet Kiev to the trading floors of Wall Street. Victor's journey has given him a unique lens on the seismic shifts reshaping our world. So brace yourselves for a conversation that will make you question the very foundations of our economic systems. Joining Victor today will be two very familiar faces. Matt Van Alstyne, he's the co-founder and managing partner of Odeon Capital Group. It's a leading full-service boutique broker dealer to institutional clients. Many of you know Matt from his commentary and outlook on the highly rated Odeon Capital Conversations podcast. And of course, John Aidan Byrne. John is a veteran Wall Street business journalist, editor, filmmaker, and successful podcast host of Odeon Capital Conversations and Dig Life Deep. And his newest ventures are two movie projects, one on the legendary life of a Wall Street CEO and scholar, and the other on Norman Rockwell. So let's get started by welcoming Matt, John, and Victor to the stage. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hello. Yeah. So we're in a little past, in November. Election's over, which we've been talking about for an eternity, it seems. And we got a lot to talk about. And Victor, your book couldn't be more timely. And I was going to, I think one of the ways we can title this episode might be Back to the Future. So since we're talking, since you're referencing, as many people are, it seems to have a similar feel, although none of us were around. Although my kids may think I was, but none of us were around in the 1930s. But going back almost a century, it has very similar feelings. But why don't we kick this off we did your introduction, but telling us a little bit about the book. We had a really fascinating conversation going into it. We're already into it, but if you can, for our listeners, give it a little introduction of why you wrote this book, why it's important now, and then we're going to fire away. So it's your state.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Essentially, the book is written because I think the next decade is going to be one of the most transformational that any of us have experienced. And there are very, very good reasons for that, because the transformational periods occur when people do not agree what is the right business model, economic model, political model, social models. It's a times of disputes. It's a time of friction when new things really come about and the whole system suddenly changes. So if you think of generation that grew up through terrible times in 1930s and 1940s, that had a very different view as to what should be allowed, should not be allowed, what sort of constraints you need to impose on society, on interaction, on capitalism, what role should the government play in governing ourselves as well as governing the economy. And so if you think of consensus of 1950s and 60s, it was not liberal by any stretch of imagination, either politically, socially, or economically. But generation who suffered so much through that period was prepared to accept those constraints and had the benefit of faster growth rates, GI Bill, infrastructure investment, suburbia, educational expenses, and the rest of it. Now, if you think of today, it's very similar in some ways to 1930s, when people really didn't agree what is the right model. So if you think of 1930s, one of the best books I like is planned economies and societies, past, present, and the future. It was written by a variety of sociologists, economists, anthropologists. There were contributions from Joseph Stalin. There was contribution from his economic minister. There was contribution from Mussolini. There was a contribution from Nazi Germany. There was also a contribution from New Deal economists from the United States, sociologists, anthropologists, and all of them agreed. And remember, this is 1937. All of them agreed that the free market liberalism turned out to be a theology, and which led to catastrophic consequences. And therefore, the question in front of them, or in front of them at the time, was not whether the government should be planning, not that we should be planning our societies and economies, but extent to which we should do that. How much free space should we leave to individuals or business sector or corporates? So everybody, whether you were Joseph Stalin, whether you were Mussolini or New Deal economists, nobody disagreed with that premise. The disagreement was, what is the right way to do this? So somebody like a communist, like Joseph Stalin, would say, I agree, free market capitalism, you see what happened. We always said that's what's going to happen. And therefore, our solution is elimination of property rights, elimination of politics, putting an avant-garde, professional class to manage societies and economies. Somebody like Mussolini also said, I agree. Our solution is we'll allow you to keep your private property and rights, but it's going to be on behalf of the nation. So you don't have a complete freedom to do things. And by the way, we're also eliminating politics, and we're also putting professional people in front. And then a lot of Americans said, you know what, maybe we need Security and Exchange Commission. Maybe we need the guardrails. Maybe we need infrastructure investment rather than completely eliminating it. And so today we're in a very similar spot. That neoliberal era that started in late 1970s, early 1980s, when baby boomers really came to power. And on their shoulders came Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman and Ronald Coase. That era from early 1980s died around global financial crisis, around 2010. After 2010, we no longer agreed what is the right business, economic, and social model. How far should we go in planning and regulating our societies? And that is why there are alternatives proliferating. Just like in 1930s, there was the communist alternative, fascist alternative, constrained democracy alternative. Today, China propagating an alternative, Russia, Iran, United States is trying to find an alternative way. So does Europe. And so alternatives starting to proliferate. And that tension is building in societies. It's polarizing societies. And so what my book argued is that we're probably going back to 1950s. In other words, a much more constrained society, just like the generation who grew up in 30s and 40s accepted that in 1950s and 60s. Government much more prevalent and penetrating all areas of our life and society as we go forward. If we're lucky, and if we put the right policies in place, maybe we will avoid the world on fire of 1940s. In other words, all the social tensions and geopolitical tensions could be managed the best. And that's why my book argued that FDR in many ways is my hero. In a sense, he found the middle ground. The choice in 1930s was not between freedom and slavery. It was how much freedom needs to be sacrificed in order to avoid the worst potential outcomes. And just before we came in, my argument was in the book is that people who grow up in the terrible places like I did, we always know that things can always get worse. Even though it's bad, it can always get worse. And we always understand that institutional pillars cannot be taken for granted, because quite often they can disintegrate or they can become incredibly abusive. But in the West, whether it's US, whether it's Western Europe, 2 or 3 generations of people grow up without knowing anything bad. They treat institutional pillars as if it's air that you breathe. They never disappear. And so the attitude is very different. It is saying essentially, and that's what you saw in elections, essentially, things are not good and it can't get any worse. Try something new. And that's a very different attitude, which creates us at polarization issues. It creates attack on institutional pillars, and depending how far we want to go in attacking those pillars. So it creates all sorts of things. So from my perspective, the key to understand my book, and I think what's coming up, is not that capitalism will not change. It's already changing. It's not that the role of state will not change. It's already changing. It's not that the role of society will not change. It's already changing. It's how can we find that middle ground that FDR found in 1930s and 40s? How can we forge a new consensus that will not evolve into a world on fire of 1940s?
Wow, that was a lot. I'm really impressed. My first question is, you said in 2010 we decided that the current world order wasn't working. Who is we? Like, was there ever a point where Russia and China and the WTO and the G20 and the G8 and the G7 all agreed, or was it just more of there was this vacuum, America was a hegemon, and the other countries didn't get their voice heard, and America didn't realize there was a vacuum, and now it's almost gone from hegemonic to multipolar, and you have China and Russia that think that they're equivalent, even though arguably they may or may not be. But like, and who's the we that's fighting right now?
It's everybody. One of the things my book highlights is that if you were in 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, it didn't really make a difference whether you're Democrat or Republican. There was very little difference really between George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, or even Obama. In other words, everybody agreed on the basic principles. And the basic principles were that the public sector generally is inefficient, quite often is unjust. Private sector solutions deliver the best outcomes because they have market prices to judge them. And so whether you were Labour or Conservative in the UK, Labour or Liberal in Australia, Democrats or Republican in the United States, they were all singing broadly from the same hymn book. There was not much difference. After 2010, that started to change rapidly. One example I cite is when Hank Paulson, who at that time was the Secretary of the Treasury, when he visited China, Chinese vice premier said, "We no longer have anything to learn from you." In other words, the global financial crisis was such a shock to Chinese leadership that from that point on, they've decided all the past experiences that we had and all the past experiments we tried, such as democratic experiments at the local level, which was proliferating all the way through the early 2000s. Things like reducing the role of the state in running the economy, converting state-owned enterprises much more towards, much more towards social objectives rather than efficiency and profit maximization, removing separation between party and bureaucracy. Between 1980 and 2010, party and bureaucracy were separated and separated more and more every year. After 2010, it's ended. In other words, party and bureaucracy started to merge together. SOEs started to get much larger. China at that point decided that instead of trying to change itself in order to continue to integrate in the global world, which is the prior generation of Chinese leaders were advocating, they would rather change the world in order to make it much more amenable to the way China prefers to operate. Again, if you think 2008-10, that's exactly what the sharp turn in Russia. I was based in Lehman Brothers back then in Moscow, and you could see the palpable shift that the global financial crisis made in Russia itself. And from then on, that led to the Georgia War, for example, 08-09. That led to 2014 in Crimea. So in other words, Russia has decided there is no longer a consensus that they are willing to subscribe to. And if you think of the United States, think of Republican Party and the Democratic Party back in 2000. In 2000 elections, Gore versus Bush. The Republican Party actually, the districts voting for Bush actually accounted for 53% of the population. If you think of GDP that those districts contributed to the United States, that was 46% of GDP. And okay, the Gore had a little bit more popular vote than Bush, but essentially they were relatively evenly matched. Look at 2020. 24, we don't have numbers yet, but look at 2024. At 2020. In 2020, Trump won 86% of counties, but they represented only 40% of population, only 30% of GDP of the United States. So, in other words, the remaining counties were the bulk of GDP and the bulk of the population. Numbers have shifted more, a little bit more right now, but not dramatically in 24 versus 2020. So what you're seeing is that Republican Party, Bush's Republican Party, have shifted in a very different background. If you think of the conservatives in the United Kingdom, for example, and the way conservatives today are not conservative, and so we can go on. And so it's not that any particular person made a decision, is that the environment changed so dramatically that each of those countries have decided that the previous consensus no longer applies. There is a new consensus. Now, one thing the book addresses is what drives those changes. It's not about hegemony of the United States or anything like that. That is not true. What drives it is essentially what I call Fujiwara effect, or a merger of highly disruptive information technology with financialization, aggravated by more than 3 decades of neoliberal policies that basically amplified inequalities, created all sorts of other disruptions. And so to me, that's the essence. And it blows up in 2010. It gets worse over subsequent decade. Now, it's not unusual to have several decades transition. So in other words, think of late 20s to late 40s. Think of late 60s to early 80s. It's not unusual to have a long transition where society does not agree what is the right thing to do, does not agree on the right models, and that's just where we're now. Eventually what happens, and that's the other part of the book, is that new generation imposes their own will. And so today, if you think of Millennial and Z generation, survey after survey after survey, they consistently showing that they think about life are very different to their parents and grandparents. And they are building a new consensus. But today, they are not yet electoral majority, but they will be within 5 years or so.
Victor, I'm going to cut in here. And then Matt, I know, has a bunch of questions. But I read your book and it's fascinating. I actually don't agree with all your thesis, but I love your research, the approach you took. And I know a lot of college professors said they want to have it on the syllabus for a bunch of classes. That does not surprise me. There's data in there I'm never aware of. But you mentioned a couple of things. The fusion of technology and finance has driven this shocking upheaval, the ruptures we're seeing. And then you said the financialization of the global economy has now reached a stage that capital, for the first time in human history, exceeds real demand by at least 5 to 10 times, whereas in the 1950s to 1980s, it was broadly in line with GDP. And you also ask, why do I compare our times to the 1930s rather than a more conventional comparison to the 1970s, which in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has dominated discussion in popular and financial press. You go on to say, you answer yourself by saying there were just far too many factors in common between our environment today and in the 1930s for it to be an accident. I have an interesting question because you don't actually address it. I thought you might have. The rise of central banking in the 20th century. The rise of central banking. There's some analysts out there would say that has fueled a lot of our despair, our ruptures. It financed many of our two great wars. It has financed this massive global debt of 300 billion, our domestic and US debt, and the central banks need to be reined in. That's the nub of maybe of our problems. In one,
yeah, well, it's actually, yeah. If I can just collect one thing, it's a trillion, not billion. Billion these days is nothing. It's actually trillions. But just coming back to that, it's a chicken and egg. Whenever people say central banks needs to be reined in, I usually say, if you're a man, when you shave in the morning, look yourself in the mirror. You are the guilty party, not the central banks. You asked for it. They delivered what you asked. So if you think of 1950s, 60s, even 70s, the amount of capital liquidity required for every dollar of GDP was roughly 1-to-1, maybe 1.5-to-1. By the time Paul Walker started to remake our system, and by the way, Paul Walker is responsible for today's central banks and what's happening with liquidity and everything else. But by the time Paul Walker got going, it was something like 1.5 times. By the time you get to Greenspan put in 1987, it was more than 2 times. In other words, liquidity that you have relative to GDP or financial assets relative to GDP. By the time you get to Bernanke, it's actually something in the vicinity of 3-to-1. By the time you get to today, it's at minimum 6. It could be as much as 10 times. And so the question then becomes, is it central banks or is it the people? Now, my answer is that baby boomers, when they actually got control of the economy, and remember, baby boomers didn't see the bad stuff. They never experienced the bad stuff of 1930s, the wars, the pandemics, the hyperinflation, deflation, collapses of institutions. They've never seen any of that stuff. So from their point of view, government was more of an impediment to their freedom. And that was reflected in the flower culture, in Woodstock, but the same flower culture people and the drug sort of people ended up investment bankers and flippers of property and the rest of it later on. And so that desire for freedom, you give me the rope and I make a decision whether I want to hang myself with it or I'm going to succeed. Do not guarantee my results. Give me the opportunity. I want to be able to marry anybody I want or divorce anybody I want. I want to move the countries. I want to change my jobs anytime I feel like doing it. I want to create new things. That created lots of opportunities and lots of freedom. It was the freest time through 80s and 90s and early 2000s ever. So it created lots of opportunities, but it had a massive side effects. And those side effects are freedom has its price. Whenever people say, I'm for freedom, freedom from what? And freedom to do what? Those are the questions. And so that freedom had its price. And the check, so to speak, arrived in the global financial crisis of 2010. And one of the prices is that baby boomers insisted on income growth, wealth growth, irrespective of productivity, irrespective of consequences, whether it's economic, environmental, inequalities, whatever they are. I want to keep on going. And so to my view, Paul Walker, Greenspan, and Bernanke answered what people or consensus actually wanted. But now you reach the stage, as the book discussed, there is no going back. There's no way you can recreate sound money or anything like that again. If you've gone through decades of money supply growing faster than nominal GDP, the difference between the 2 lines is your 401k pension plans. It's the houses you live in. It's the house prices. It's assets. And assets from late 80s become the primary cue for all economic decisions, whether it's households, whether it's corporates, whether it's to save or to splurge, to buy, to go on holidays, or whether it's to invest or do share buybacks. And so you reach the stage, there is no way of going back. And so the only objective, I guess, of central banks now is making sure that the dog doesn't sit on a tail. So in other words, the way I describe in the book is that in the olden days, real economy was a dog and a financial economy was a tail. Today, financial economy is a dog and a real economy is a little thing attached to the back of the dog. And so the entire objective of central banking now is to make sure that the dog does not sit on the tail. Now, that does imply that the tolerance to volatility of asset prices is getting less and less. It does imply that capital market cycles no longer exist. As you quoted me, we now have excess capital that we've never seen before. Now, that explains why spreads don't widen, even though you might have tightening occurring. That explains why there is no flare-ups in bad debts or provisioning levels, even though economies might be suffering. So we have a massive excess of capital. When you have a massive excess of capital, that means prices that don't work. In a world of abundance, prices do not work. Now, that creates a problem for Federal Reserve. How do you tighten when your price signals are not traveling through this massive capital, which is fluctuating and dividing itself for its own sake, so to speak, as you go forward. But it also softens the economy at the same time. So it's all not negative. There is a positive element to it as well. Also, don't forget that we've been subjecting economic cycles to massive, massive pressures for at least 50 years. And so the result is we no longer have economic cycles. We no longer have capital market cycles. Both of them are gone. They don't exist anymore. And so the question then becomes, how do you manage economies or financial markets that are supposed to be predicated on mean reversion? They're supposed to be predicated on some degree of cyclicality if those things no longer relevant.
Matt, do you want to come in there? Matt, you're muted.
You hit on a lot of points there, and I feel like we need to go back and like start hitting on one by one, just so our audience is not nearly. I'm not nearly at the level to understand half of what you've said. Are you comparing the 1930s financial crisis and like the financial dystopia that Germany was after World War I and led to the rise of Hitler to 2010 in America, or am I missing the point? Because I would kind of argue, if I'm hearing correctly, like Germany in the 1930s was an export economy, and its problem was that it owed reparations to the rest of the world, and that created a huge economic imbalance.
It's not the case. It's nothing to do. It's nothing to do with reparations. It's nothing to do with anything like that. Well, it's essentially what you have. Germany is not the only example of 1930s. Everybody is just focusing on Germany, but you have to remember, in 1930s in the United States, you had Huey Long, former governor of state of Louisiana, who was a womanizer. He was a rough guy. He ruled Louisiana with a hard edge, and he had the Share of Our Wealth campaign, and that's a version not just of capital gains taxes but universal basic income. In 1935, before he was assassinated, he was polling 3-4 million votes. In those days, that's a lot of votes. Yeah. There was also a concern at the time that he might derail FDR and FDR's campaign. There was the father, Charles Coughlin, in Michigan. His sermons and his program in 1930s was attracting 30 million listeners. Even today, 30 million is a huge number, but think of 1930s, what that number was. And he was advocating expropriating Jewish wealth, expropriating bankers, doing all of that. 1930s was a period where Ku Klux Klan came to dominate U.S. politics. It was described as effectively invisible government of the United States at the time. It was a time when the communists were proliferating. It's not surprising in the early 1950s they found so many communists, because in the 1930s, the communism was proliferating. It's the only, as far as I know, apart from January 6th, it's the only instance that I'm aware of that the Senate actually discussed how 500,000 fascist volunteers were planning to take over U.S. government. So 1930s was a period when Italy got much more fascist than it was before. Imperial Japan abandoned their previous liberal experiments. China's previous liberal experiments collapsed. Germany, of course, went fascist. France was completely ungovernable. Basically, on a 6-monthly basis, you were switching from left to right to left to right without any degree of semblance of governance. So it's not just a Germany. What you had on a global basis, almost any way you look at, is that people fundamentally disagreed. So in other words, people were suffering so much, both in terms of inequality, in terms of income, in terms of perception whether corporates and banks are doing the right job by the community, in terms of belief in institutional pillars. They so disagreed that they were maximizing the extremes. They're maximizing them. And so do we have something similar today? Well, the answer is yes. Think of UK elections, sudden shift from right to left. Think of Poland, sudden shift from right to left. Think of Italy, shift to the right. France, massive shift to the right. Netherlands, massive shift to the right. Look at a populist wave in European union elections. Look at Republicans and Democrats today. They're very, very different. As I discussed in the book, they don't even live next to each other. They don't talk to each other. They don't listen to the same news. They don't socialize. They don't even marry each other, and very seldom have friends, which is not dissimilar what was found in 1930s, whether you had sort of the unemployed men were gravitating more towards communist, housewives, sort of petite bourgeoisie, rural inhabitants, lawyers were gravitating more towards extreme right and fascism. The center that always governs coherent societies collapsed. And so what we have seen in electoral cycles over the last several years, that center right now is also collapsing, just like it did in 1930s. But it's not just, Germany had reparations, so Germany. It was a profound global event that occurred pretty much everywhere. And we are not even talking about collectivization or industrialization of Russia and the way Russia shifted very dramatically through the 1930s.
Also in 1931, Victor, Germany had a banking crisis, and Germany was a huge importer of American capital. So that was a factor in the destabilization and a prelude, in a sense, one of the contributing factors to the societal tension in Germany in the 1930s. But I would also argue that, sorry, Matt.
And in the United States, by the way, too.
And in the United States, yeah. But the scale of everything today, the scale of the capital formation, the amount, you call it a cloud of finance, is the phrase you use in your book. And it's digital finance. There was no digital finance in the 1930s.
Yeah, well, there are differences with everything, but the equivalence, I guess, is to say people were incredibly polarized in the 1930s. They are polarized today. Societies were polarized in the 1930s. They are today. In 1970s, there was no alternative to sort of capitalism, so to speak. Communism was already discredited. You were just trying to fine-tune existing system. In 1930s, very different approaches were proliferating. How societies should be organized, how economies should be organized. Today, very different systems. And very different suggestions also, and proposals are gravitating all over the world. In 1930s, the trust and institutional pillars disappears. The lowest ratings for Congress, for Senate, for presidency, for judiciary, for everybody. Exactly the same you have today. So in other words, people no longer trust those institutional pillars that you have. If you think of international order, League of Nations collapsed in 1930s because US never joined, and League of Nations could never figure out what to do with Japan invading Manchuria, Italy invading, Abyssinia, Soviet Union starting attack on Finland. So they couldn't figure out. So at the end of the day, League of Nations collapsed. United Nations today has one of the lowest ratings it ever had. And again, inability to tackle, whether it's Israeli-Hamas problems, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether it's China's militarization of South China Sea, whatever that is. So that's a similarity. In 1930s, you also have extreme inequalities. Again, different to 1970s. 1970s was one of the most equal societies in the world back then. 1930s, inequalities were incredibly high, both in terms of income, wealth, opportunities. Again, we have something very, very similar today. And even if you look at technology, it was technologically, I know by today's standard that doesn't look like it, but technologically incredibly volatile period in 1930s. Very similar the way it is in today. 1970s was technologically incredibly placid era, which means technology was not really disintermediating labor and capital the way it was happening in 1930s and the way it is happening today. So to me, we can draw so many parallels across the line that it's hard to conclude that this is just an anomaly. And so the question is, as I said, come back, what drives it? Now, the immediate outcome of that is what I call 3 I's: inflation, inequalities, immigration. And by the way, immigration was a major problem as well. You have to remember that deportations in the United States were the highest levels ever. Deportations in 1930s was 6 times the levels of 1920. 1920s. Germany was deporting even more people at the time. So Those three things are the inflation, or volatility of inflation, I should say, inflation, inequalities, immigration. But those three I's are just a reflection, as I said, fundamental forces, which to me is what I call Fujiwara effect, which is two or three hurricanes merging together. And that is essentially information age, very deep and disruptive financialization, aggravated by 3 decades of neoliberal policies.
Talking about the cloud of finance, you said today the bottom 50% of US households have debt to assets ratios of 75% or more, compared to 38% in 1950, while the top 10% are virtually debt-free. And is this a consequence of the central banks and government spending and all the financialization of the economy? Is that what
it's a consequence of a couple of things. Number one, information age disintermediates capital and labor. So in other words, if you think of 1990s to 2000, disintermediation was the strongest for middle managers as well as for anybody dealing with digits, like journalists, like analysts, like portfolio managers, traders, and stuff like that. Those people suddenly found that their value is decreasing, or they need to dramatically alter how they function in those economies. As we're progressing through information age, the next stage is disintermediation of atoms, of physical matter. This is your robotics, your automation, your artificial intelligence. And then finally, the next step is singularity, which is at least 2 decades away. So when technology starts propagating, it immediately changes functioning of labor and capital. It changes functioning of professions. It eliminates quite a few professions altogether. It eliminates job prospects or changes the job prospects. So that's one area. The other area is financialization itself. The way I describe it is, think of it as two beautiful children growing up. One was called information age. The other one is financialization in 1980s. In 1990s, they met each other, they married, and then now they have beautiful children. From ETFs to digital trading, they have beautiful children now coming through. So those two people, or those two forces, merged. Now, why is financialization important? Because what it does, the closer you are to the fountain of debt and assets and digital assets, the faster your wealth grows. The more you rely on wages, salaries, household chattels like houses and cars, the poorer, in a relative sense, you become. The more sensible you are, the poorer you become. The more speculative you are, the richer you become. And so the result is that by itself starts pulling people apart. Now, that progress was more extreme in the US compared to the other countries. But as I say in the book, even if you look at places like Germany, like France, like Sweden, like Japan, it's a global phenomenon that both income and wealth inequality, especially wealth inequalities, widen significantly. So if you think of the United States, top 1% controls now 35% of wealth at least. It used to be closer to 25. Top 10 controls over 70%, used to be closer to 50. The bottom 50, 60% own absolutely nothing on a net basis, absolutely nothing. And the middle was getting squeezed. So that's your inequalities working through technology, how it changes the jobs, professions, the roles you do, and financialization, which pushes wealth much more towards a speculative, if you want to call it, end of the spectrum, rather than what a lot of people would regard as sensible.
Yep. Ira.
I got a couple things here, Victor, but I'm still trying to digest a lot of it. One is, you said earlier, and just trying to bring it back to reality here where we are, trying to figure out what the next 4 years is going to look like. I think you said that with the boomers, there was just this pushback about government penetrating our lives. Okay. Ironically, although that seems to be what the Trump administration is we're going to get government out of our lives. It seems that a lot of the policies and the approaches are really government regulations. It just bent toward one way. So it doesn't seem like it's changing. It seems like the communication is changing. The messaging is changing. But I guess I'm wondering, is there going to continue to, what's it look like if there's an increase in the type of government, not the type, but the penetration, the level of government in our lives, that it's making decisions that half the populace doesn't like? Where does that compare to where we were in the 1930s or 50s or 70s?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing I find is that today's conservatives in the UK or Republicans in the United States are really not Ronald Reagan or Maggie Thatcher. They're so different. That in a sense, somebody like Maggie Thatcher genuinely believed that you must give freedom to individuals to make their decisions. Now, she was not totally consistent because politics is never consistent. And you can't really run against desire of people to have protective blankets, and you can't, because you will never get elected. You can't. So there are limitations what you can do, but they genuinely believe in that. Today's conservatives or Republicans are more populist rather than what I would describe as conservatives or Republicans. So their verbiage about let's get our government off our backs, let's reduce regulation, coincides with let's impose tariffs. Let's control prices. Like Donald Trump famously said, he wants to control interest rate at 10% and no more on the credit cards, which is not dissimilar to what Harris was discussing when she was talking about price gouging and how she's going to control price gouging. It also coincides with a desire to shift industries in a certain directions. So, for example, Republicans and conservatives love nuclear. The Democrats and Labor likes wind farm and solar, but it's the same sort of exercise. You want to encourage certain things to happen. If you listen to J.D. Vance, how he is describing protecting workers and protecting factories, I don't think that is just a wind. I think this is a genuine desire. So depending whether you have Democrats or Republicans, Labor or conservatives, you get somewhat different policies, but they do converge at a certain level. And that level is we, the government, will determine many variables, including potentially giving advice to Federal Reserve, for example, or influencing Federal Reserve decisions. And so, and the same applies to politicization of the bureaucracy. One of the things that made Anglo-Saxon countries different, and I guess Western Europe after the Second World War different, is that they had a professional, relatively non-politicized bureaucracy. Political appointees, the only country that's had political appointees is the United States, but they were very limited. Most other countries didn't even have political appointees as part of the system. And so this sort of a desire populists have, whether it's Hungary, whether it's UK, whether it's US, to get rid of what they describe as unelected bureaucrats and replace them with political appointees or somebody who's elected, is a recipe for politicization of bureaucracy. As I said, this is what always segregated Anglo-Saxons from the rest, that they had independent, relatively non-politicized professional career bureaucracy. And again, so if you look at it, you say, well, they want to interfere with us, they want to interfere with us, they want to interfere with trade, they want to interfere with tariffs, they want to interfere with interest rates. Democrats want to do something else. They actually want to spend money, whether it's encouraging R&D, whether it's encouraging, healthcare or childcare, whatever that is. But again, that is expanding the government, not contracting the government. So to me, I actually think the overlaps between the left and the right, between say Bernie Sanders on the one side and Donald Trump on the other, is actually a lot closer than what most people think.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and it's I think the premise of your book of the question was, is freedom still necessary for prosperity? So in a sense, is if everyone's more prosperous, at least there's a segment of our population for the last 2 or 3 weeks that is definitely more prosperous than they were. But if the wealth, if the inequality is diminished, Are you saying that people are willing to give up their freedoms?
Yeah, essentially, that's why I compared to East and West. I said West are marginal people. In other words, they operate on a marginal basis. Do I feel better today than yesterday? Have I made more money today than I made yesterday? Easterners, more average people. So, in other words, on average, am I better off? Am I better off than my parents or grandparents? Am I doing okay? And that separates how Chinese or Russian think versus somebody like Americans think. and so if you are in Russia or China, you know things can get really bad. As I said earlier on, things can always get worse. In the United States or Western Europe, the view is more like it can't get any worse, let's try something else, without understanding that when you try those other policies, benefit on one side has a detraction on the other side. And some of your policies which help you with inflation will detract you from inequality, or something that increases inequality or reduces inequality has other impacts. And that's why I come back to FDR, as he did in 1930s, which was incredibly polarizing climate, when people would just follow anybody who actually gives them something they can truly believe in. And so what he found is this middle ground. Can you chop enough freedoms to keep the core in place, which he did? Can you do that? Can you something needs to be sacrificed along the way. Is just the question, what is left? And is it enough to defang the extremes? And that's why some of the policies I was suggesting for a while, things like universal basic income, things like changing the structure, how the government gets funded, things like changes how you do educational expenses. What do you do with healthcare? There is a whole range of things. When people who visit Australia, and I'm Australian, so people who visit Australia comparing to US say one thing they noticed, that Australians are not angry and they don't scream and yell. and well, a lot of Americans are much angrier. And I said, well, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that, and I compare usually Melbourne in Australia with Detroit in the US. In 1970s, late 70s, Melbourne and Detroit were one of the wealthiest cities in the country. They were predominantly engineering, manufacturing oriented places. Through the 1980s, all was gone. And Melbourne became very relatively poor place and very relatively shoddy place in terms of cars people were driving, what they were doing. But if you go to Melbourne today, it's a very, very different city. It's even bigger than Sydney, and it's wealthier than Sydney. Manufacturing never came back. I mean, none of that is back in Melbourne. And so if you think of Detroit as one of the poorer cities now in the United States. So what's the difference? Well, in the early 1990s and late 80s, the government of Australia did certain things. Number one, they introduced a nationwide unemployment benefits that people can benefit from. They introduced Medicare, which means your health care more or less is taken care of. They changed educational system, whereby, yes, the government lends you money in order for you to get educated. You need to pay back, but if you don't generate certain income, within 10 years, it's forgotten and it's completely disappears. So if you take care of medical needs, pension needs, they introduced superannuation system, which is a pension needs. Everybody is obliged to contribute to that. There is no exception. So the result is Australia now has over $3 trillion in pension. It's the only country overprovided on a pension fund. So if you fix pension, if you fix healthcare, if you fix education, and if you provide some safety blanket, so to speak, for the least advantaged in the society, a lot of tensions just go away. A lot of anger simply goes away. Now, United States preference was always to leave people twisting in the wind. You'll figure it out for yourself what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So what you need to do is to go back to 1950s, when the United States government was not letting people just twisting in the wind. So what you do, you go back and you say, okay, what policies do you require in order to lower tensions, in order to defang the extremes, and keep as much freedom and choice as you possibly can. And I think that was the essence of FDR, whether it was unemployment benefit, healthcare benefit he was introducing, whether it's infrastructure policy, whether it's regulatory policies he was introducing. And that set consensus in late 40s on a global basis. Effectively, FDR set consensus, not just for the United States, but for the whole world, from late 1940s until late 1960s, early 1970s.
So, and I know this wasn't raised. I don't think I heard these words throughout the campaign, was universal basic income, but it almost sounds as if the Trump administration wanted to expand their base, it would be to initiate universal basic income, because the resistance to the loss of freedoms would go away. Is that what you're saying? I mean, in part,
no. I'm saying if you have to remember, the guy who wanted to introduce universal basic income in the United States was Richard Nixon, who was Republican. At the end of the day, he was defeated because the idea of freedom is so ingrained, deeply ingrained in the societal culture of the United States that it's one of those things that's incredibly hard to overcome. And that is, I said, what FDR was battling in as well. That's why he was accused at the time of creating Bolshevik America, even though it was nothing like a Bolshevik America. and so you have that restriction. And that's why whether you're Bernie Sanders, he's probably more extreme, but whether you say Elizabeth Warren or whether you Kamala Harris, if you really ask them, they would prefer universal basic income. But they know that you can't get there. For Republicans, it's more like supporting hard-working Americans, whatever the hell that means. And therefore, basically what you do, you create impression. I will cut taxes. You don't say on whom, but it sounds like they're going to cut taxes on me. Or I'm going to have terrorists protecting workers, that he must be protecting me. So, but at the same time, what I said in the book, and that was written, of course, before the elections and before all of this, what I basically said that extreme right and left all are shifting to a similar position, that the government will be more intrusive. And therefore, the freedom that private sector enjoyed in 1980s, 1990s, and say for the first decade or so of 2000s, is not coming back. And so one of the things corporates need to do is to redesign the objectives and purpose of what corporates are there for. You already have seen that. If you think of US Business Council, they reject the purpose in 2019. It's no longer profit maximization. It is no longer serving shareholders. So they already changed the definition in 2019. I think US Business Council will just keep going in the same direction. Getting the objectives of corporates closer to what corporates perceived the objective to be in 1950s and 60s than the objective that they felt they had in 1980s or 90s.
Part of it kind of bothers me, this thrust of your arguments. I mean, you see a role for government, a stronger role. My concern is that if the government interferes too much and we, develop this kind of a bailout sort of mentality, the economy will ultimately collapse. We saw in the old Soviet Union, no company ever failed. No company ever went bankrupt. The government stepped in and bailed them out, and the Soviet Union imploded.
But we're already bailing out. That's why I said there are already no economic or capital market cycles. So in other words, the government or Federal Reserve doesn't mind if you, John, personally lose money. That's okay. Even if one asset class goes up, but another one goes down, that's okay too. But nothing systemic is allowed. We saw it with the repo crisis in 2019, if you remember, when Federal Reserve stepped in and created an emergency repo facility. We saw it with Silicon Valley Bank in 2023. Basically, when something that looks systemic, it usually arrives on Tuesday, Wednesday. People panic on Thursday. By Monday, it's all fixed. Done. And so whether you look at bailout economically or financially, we're already doing it. There's no point of discussing it. That's already happening. The only question is the capital that we bail out, how we bail out that capital, where should this capital be invested? That's the essence of J.D. Vance arguments, by the way. If you believe in what he says, that's the essence of J.D. Vance argument. But not dissimilarly, that's the essence of Harris' argument too. Was like that. We have a lot of capital out there. We have a massive surplus of capital, but it's staying in a cloud of finance, multiplying for its own sake, occasionally coming down to the ground, but not frequently, creating inequalities, creating other things, creating deflationary and disinflationary pressures rather than inflationary pressures. And what increasing number of politicians are saying, we need to have control where that capital goes. Now, a lot of people say, but that's inefficient. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. What happened in stagflation in 1970s in Europe. But my argument is, you're not choosing between the good and the bad. You're choosing between two bads. And so the question is, which bad do you think is going to be worse? Either societally, politically, economically, as you go. There is no perfect, pure answers. Pure answers only live in laboratories and ivory tower of economists, but in real life, they do not exist. and so that's my point. And I think one of the things I said in the book, would the government overreach? Of course it would. It always does. But what's the alternative? I said, well, let's rein in central banks. And what? Your 401k disappears? Suddenly systemic events are allowed to come through. House that you bought for $1 million might be worth $500,000. Is it what you want? And the answer for everybody, no, that is not what we want. So to me, arguing about going back to more conventional economic cycles and monetary and capital market cycles tend to miss the point. You can't do this anymore. There is no way back. The only way is forward. And the only question is, as you go forward, how do you place systems in place to reduce the tensions?
We are way past where we intended to be on time. But so I want to start a wrap.
I apologize. I talked too much.
No. It's been fascinating. You have our attention, for sure. But I want to I'm going to give Matt the toughest job of all. I don't know if there's one question or a comment, Matt, that you can throw out to sort of wrap today up.
I mean, the crazy.
I think we're going to transcribe this later and read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated world. Like, that's basically it. And I don't know.
And sometimes it's more complicated than the others. As I said, there are times which are relatively placid. Neither technology, no financialization disrupt societies aggressively. Societies as a whole broadly agree with what's happening. And that's why 50s and 60s are regarded as a golden age. But there are times, and by the way, the same was applying to 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, that people felt that everything was gelling. They understand how the world works. When Greenspan said that he was puzzled and surprised and upset that his view of the world turned out to be wrong. This is after global financial crisis in 2008. The chairman of the commission, I think it was Waxman at the time, but anyway, he said, so does it mean that your ideology is incorrect? And do you have an ideology? And Greenspan correctly said, we all have ideology. People always have. It's just a question whether your ideology is in line with whatever happening right now. And he was basically saying it was no longer in line, and that very upset him because he was a steward of monetary policy of the United States for 19 years. And he built his philosophy of life gradually through 60s and 70s. And he so firmly believed in that philosophy, which was in line with baby boomers' philosophy too. He so believed that he was shocked. And that's the word he used, actually. He was shocked. And so there are times, and it just so happens our lifetime is that lifetime. I mean, I'm older than you, Matt. So I remember the other times too. But for you, it's unfortunate that bulk of your productive life will be in that period. And that is, And that is the way it is. There is no point of arguing with it.
I was told that in Chinese, I'm sure it's not true, that the word for crisis is the same word for opportunity. And so hopefully the volatility creates opportunity for us.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And so that's why 1930s and as well as 70s were opportunities. The question is, what type of opportunities are they? The question where those opportunities lies, how you use them. And the problem is that anybody who, even if you think of, let's say, late 1980s, early 2000s, I was doing technology at the time. If anybody told me that Microsoft will actually transit from the sort of first generation tech to a second, I wouldn't have thought so. People are punting on Nokia, on Cisco, on IBM, on all sorts of stuff, but not Microsoft. And so what you have, and that's one of the things I also discussed, that the more we compress economic and capital market cycles, the more we accelerate business cycles. So in other words, replacement of products, businesses, marketing strategy changes much faster, which means you can create a very large company today in a space of 1 year. Whereas previously it would have taken you a decade or longer to get to that point. So are those opportunities? That's a classic example of NVIDIA. Are those opportunities? The answer, absolutely. But they shift very, very rapidly. And so what one needs to do, which is hard, is to stay on top of that. Because as I said, one answer could change very quickly to another answer in a matter of quarters.
Matt, I know you need to drop off. And we're going to start wrapping things up. Victor, we're going to give you a chance to introduce where people can get your book and reach out to you. We're definitely doing a transcription of this because as John already suggested, people are going to want to read this and digest it as well as your book. But I did have a real quick question. So you're obviously, you mentioned moving toward that singularity. So Ray Kurzweil has famously said that we will experience the next century of change within 10 years. So we're going to have 100 years of progress within the next 10 years. So if that's true, and everything you're saying is we're going to experience all the economic, financial, and political events from 1930 to 2030 within the next decade. Exactly.
I was a little bit more cautious. I said late 2030s, early 2040s, but basically 10 years might not be enough, but late 2030s, early 2040s will be the answer.
I just want to add, Victor, a fascinating book. I don't share all your optimism. I think some of our problems are values-based, but that's going down a rabbit hole. But great information. And by the way, you said you said the information revolution will ultimately lead to higher incomes, better health outcomes, and longevity, and perhaps even greater happiness. Eventually, probably sometime in the 2040s, productivity growth rates will likely explode to 4 to 5%. So 20 years time or whenever, we're going to see an explosion in productivity and paradise, nirvana, I guess.
Yes. The only question is how do we get from A to B? So it's not the question that by, say, early 2040s, we have higher productivity, better healthcare outcomes, better everything. It's just in those 10 to 20 years, can we avoid a world on fire? How we can put policies in place to reduce tensions, define the extremes, sacrifice some rights and some freedoms, inevitably that has to go with it, but protect it. As I said earlier, people who grow up in the countries where I grew up know institutions can fail. They know things can always get worse. They know that you don't take it for granted. And that's what the book tries to address. What policies, I think, will help you along that path.
Yeah, and that certainly brings up the whole question. Certainly technology is a huge part of the abundance mindset. And that acceleration and creating that, which brings up a whole other discussion of what guidelines or regulations, if any, should be put on AI. and where that goes. So, but that's for another day. That's a very, very long conversation. Love it. Well, hopefully we'll have you back again. Just wondering if your next book is going to be The Dawn After the Storm.
I don't know. I'll get over this one, and then we'll see. My first one was done in 2020, second one 24. So I was thinking maybe by the time we get to late 20s, if I'm still around, maybe something like that will work.
Yeah, hoping that would be the solution that everybody's looking for. Victor, how can they get in touch with you? How can they get a hold of your book?
Well, in terms of my book, it's available at Amazon, and anybody can order it in a hard copy, soft copy, or a digital copy. In terms of myself, I'm reasonably active on LinkedIn. I tend not to be on Twitter, but on LinkedIn, I'm reasonably active. And so there are quite a few notes I usually post.
Very good. And the book, for those listening, is The Twilight Before the Storm. Victor, thank you very, very much. We will, as I said, I will add the transcription of this so people can read it and digest it as well, because it certainly was an incredibly fast, rich, robust conversation. And thank you for sharing everything you did. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Ira. And thank you, John.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. And for all our listeners, we will be back again next month with another guest. We'll continue this conversation about the corner of Main Street and Wall Street. And until next month, remember, don't let the shift hit your plans.